that.
Yeah.
Ready? I'd like to call this special meeting of the Board of Education on Tuesday, February 24th to order. Adam, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Argo.
Here.
Mr. Gordon.
Here.
Mr. Wynn.
Here.
Ms. Schaefer.
Here.
Ms. Casper.
Here. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I need a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Mr. Zink, please call the roll.
Mr. Wynn.
Yes.
Ms. Schaefer.
Yes.
Mr. Argo.
Yes.
Mr. Ford.
Yes.
Ms. Casper.
Yes. Forget our names. Okay. We are here to do a master's facility discussion. So I don't know, Ashley, Tom, I don't know who's starting this.
So just a reminder, we're gonna start with just a little bit of an update with Tom and the enrollment study. But purpose of this meeting, I know we saw each other last night for a while, but purpose of this meeting is, on Tuesdays we have our master facilities kind of quorum committee meeting, and those are always super productive, but not every team member can be there, right? And so wanting to make sure that just to kind of keep a steady momentum, keep a steady pace, have this special meeting to make sure that we could all be in the room together and kind of talk about, I want to say, the pressing next issues of options, what those options or possibilities for community feedback could be, the timeline. I don't want to assume, but I think we're heavily discussing November and what that looks like. And then also eventually coming to those funding sources, which are certainly tied to the options piece. So really, I think the first two big buckets are our main focus tonight are the options piece. Where are we? And then how or if or when that ties to a community engagement and what that looks like. So as you know, they had asked for a recent enrollment update. And I'll let Tom or Craig speak a little bit more, but we had given them some numbers and they got back to us with those numbers, and they're lower than we anticipated. So we're in the part of, I'm going to use the word appeal. I think that's the right word, appealing that. But I'm going to let Tom talk through that because they are lower than what we had anticipated from the 18-month enrollment study that we did or we had received previously. So Tom, I'm going to kick that over to you.
Good evening. Yes, it is concerning because the projection at this point is about 20% lower than it was the last time they did it 18 months ago. We're looking to have a meeting to better understand those numbers. And we had even questioned why they're doing it, but because it was over a year, they wanted, as we transition into CFAP from the ELP program, they thought it was appropriate, so that's fine. We're obviously wanting the best, most accurate numbers. I just at this point feel uncomfortable that the numbers that we're seeing aren't accurate, or the numbers that they produced previously, the state provided, were terribly inaccurate. So something has to reveal itself over the next couple of weeks. So I think that's the process that we're going through. The actual numbers have been fairly flat over the last 5 years, as Craig and I have been looking at those and gathering information to provide them. So I don't think there's going to be a big significant change in where they're projecting their new projections. With that, I will tell you, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Strangely enough, because you are in the process of going to CFAP and segmenting your project. If you were going to build the entire thing at once, then it wouldn't matter. But as you segment and you say, well, we're going to concentrate on this first, this package first, then knowing that there's future phases, as you come back to them with future phases, whether they be renovations or additions or new buildings, whatever they be, there will be another assessment at that point. So you'll go through a series of assessments, and obviously if it's 4 years down the road or 5 years down the road, that those numbers will will hopefully be accurate and still looking into the future, into a 10-year future at that point, but they'll have much more data to appropriately size the district to what your community needs.
Wasn't our first OFCC enrollment study much different than the private one we paid for? Wasn't there a significant one? The private one digs deeper.
The private one is definitely more specific to our zip code,
Right.
rather than just like who actually lives in those zip codes, rather than the zip codes encompassing. It just looks at the first one, just looked at the census data, but the numbers weren't drastically different. Not like we're seeing in this particular study.
Because what they look, I'm sorry, Doug, what they look at is 45044 as a zip code, and
Not
45044 includes Middletown.
correct.
Yeah, if I
The second
recall,
one.
when we first got the state's numbers back, we were questioning it because it was so different from our previous enrollment studies, and that's why we did the private one, which kind of actually validated
Yeah.
the state numbers.
Correct.
The old
So-
state numbers, right?
No, the new, like,
The
Yeah,
newer
the-
version.
the-
new old.
The new
Yeah.
one. Yeah.
the ones at the time that they made from the
Yeah.
state, not this version, yes, yeah.
Now, what's interesting is, and we had questioned this, but obviously, if there's a new interchange on 75, you would think that that would bring in a lot of new homes and businesses and so on. They don't take that into consideration. It's something that we're gonna really push for and try to get more data on. Is it happening in 5 years, which is what I've heard. But if we could provide a little bit more information about that, then that might help adjust your numbers. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because you're segmenting. My only concern is, what have you said to the voters previously?
Right.
And how do you explain a change? And the state's gonna have to come in and really help us understand that, because it's a difficult conversation to have.
To Tom's point about the enrollment study, I know before we had the private one, when we had the one by the state, that was the one where we were like, are these numbers accurate, with all of the new things? And we talked about, the Milliken Exchange coming and all of those things. And so we did, at that time, provide a wealth of data to them from the townships, saying like, these are the new subdivisions that are coming, these are the new interchanges. And to Tom's point, the lady kind of said, thank you, and we'll make reference to that, but it doesn't really change the numbers in any way. And she just, they could never fully explain that. I spent about an hour and a half on a Zoom call with her trying to say, how do these not impact our enrollment numbers? And she said, well, we just kind of mention them. We kind of like assumptions. We kind of mention them in the assumptions, but they don't really change the overall numbers. And so that held true at that time as well. But then that's why we coupled it with the private study. So I responded, actually Tom and I got the email, we were on the phone together, when she was trying to secure some dates, for next week. So I responded back with my availability for next week. So hopefully we can get that scheduled and start that kind of appeal process. I don't mean that to sound as formal, but that's what they call it when you don't agree with the number. So we are appealing those to see if anything would come from that.
I'm wondering, did they change their fundamental formula perhaps based on any assumptions around vouchers? Like, do we know if there's been like just a fundamental change in their philosophy?
We don't know.
It would be odd considering the enrollment from vouchers hasn't really increased.
I-
It's just the
I
existing
just
enrollment.
Didn't
So,
know if it was
yeah.
a way for them to redo things at a lower level.
Would be closer to 18,000 students by now.
And on Monday, so I have Monday, today's the 24th. Monday's enrollment was 17,048 students. A year ago, and so if you look in 2024, if you looked at that exact same date, 17,380.
I know some of our enrollment numbers have been impacted not only by like the number of kids who've gone to, say, for example, Butler Tech, that we lose some of the full-time equivalents, as well as like kids who are part-time and, you know, as well as we've kicked out people who were here with open enrollment. Like, so does that then get built into the trend, even though it's based on actions we've taken in the delivery of our offerings?
Well, I'd say all of that comes into play. You know, we have not, I mean, she's only been employed since January, but you know, Miss Craig looking at that residency piece and making sure we're auditing that appropriately. Again, I don't think you're seeing any major numbers from that 'cause she's only been here for January, but you have that. As you know, we're kind of revamping the ASC form. That doesn't influence these particular numbers, but it influences pockets within the district. And then what you just said about a part-time equivalent, just for reference, a high school student has to be taking 5 credits, 5 full-time credits to be able to consider it a full-time student. Anybody taking lower than that is not considered a full-time equivalent, and therefore you get a portion of your state funding, and they're not considered. They would be calculated differently in these numbers. We don't have a great deal of those, but we do have some of those just because of sometimes you see that in students with very creative schedules, like if you had a student who's preparing for the Olympics or maybe a national equestrian or something like that. And then also you sometimes see that with medical diagnoses where they have like weakened immune systems and things like that. And so they have to take their credits in a different way. So, but again, that's probably not what you're seeing in these they're not drastic, but in these kind of numbers, I would say those are small, but they do have some impact for sure. All right, so that was the enrollment study piece. So let's go back to options. And if you don't have your folder, I can certainly put this up on the screen, the options piece that we've been looking at, the C1 and the D1. So in essence, if we boil it down, C1 and D1, if you recall, C1 was the 2 junior highs. And then D1 is the 4 junior high school. Just popped right on. Great. And so with that, again, this is the C1 and there's D1, but I also, and there are some price points that we can go back to, but those are the biggest difference, right? 4 junior highs and 2 junior highs. And certainly I think, and I don't want to oversimplify, but it could be that, we engage the community around C1 and D1 further, right? You know, we gave some preliminary, it was a thought exchange, not a statistically relevant survey or anything like that, but we could get more information around those 2 models. I know though that in our discussion, particularly like, you know, Doug has mentioned, like, I don't know if these options are it for me. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if there's another option there that we want to explore. So I think that's the question on the table of, are we comfortable engaging, and we can talk about what engaging looks like, C1 and D1 in our community, or do we think that there is another iteration out there that we would want to get some community feedback on? And I say community feedback in the options because ultimately, if we were to go on the ballot in November, the latest a vote could be taken is June and July. Ideally, you would button that vote up in May. I would say the earlier in May, the better, because May is crazy, right? We got the graduations in the end of the year, but I would say, again, you're probably aiming for that May, because I think we just want that buttoned up before the summer and making sure we had a plan. And so that would really leave kind of March, which is knocking at the door next week, right? March and April, to engage the community around an option, to then have some information to make that decision of what option and funding source, and then November ballot for sure or not. So I think that's just kind of a rough timeline. That's the sketch in my head. It doesn't mean we're beholden to that, but I think we need to talk about the options and how that would look to engage the community in potentially the next 2 months.
A few minutes ago, I emailed everybody a copy of the ballot issue schedule. July 6th is for the voted bond issue only. July 6th is that deadline. And then if it was a bond issue combined with an income tax, that's July 21st, or income tax standalone, July 24th, operating or permanent improvement, August 5th. So that's the 4 options.
Different for different
in the
funding
timeline.
sources?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize that. That's ridiculous.
Makes sense.
Just to make it harder.
Why wouldn't it?
Why wouldn't it be?
Right. Just got to keep more.
Not later than. Let's go that route. These
Yeah.
are the not later than dates.
So Adam, July 6th is income tax?
That's the bond issue only, standalone.
July 6th bond, what's the 21st? Will you read them again?
That's the voted bond issue combined with an income tax. So if you did a segmented, or not segmented, but a double,
That sounds hard to explain.
then income tax only. Or combined with property tax, I missed that part, July 24th. And then an operating or permanent improvement levy. Or emergency, August 5th.
What if, let's just make it more common, what if you did a bond and a PI? Is that, where's that? I mean, is that August 5th or is that July 6th? I'm not saying we
I
are.
think it's July 6th, isn't it?
July 6th.
Okay.
And you have those in your email. And I put in the
Okay, thank you.
subject line, November 3rd, 2026 deadlines.
And I think we have that same schedule, hard copy in one of our master facilities meetings too, so it should probably be in that green folder that we have as well. Thoughts about options?
Do we have to pick option and funding at the same time to, because
You mean
do we
funding
pick
school?
option and then go to the community with the option? And then funding is just how we decide to fund it?
I mean, so I'll again, speak.
Yes.
I think, yes, because one, you have the option. There's option and what it cost, right? I mean, that's money and funding, but then there's the funding source. I mean, I really think as long as you have the option and the cost,
Right.
then we can determine separately. And because I think one of the reasons that we waited is we're trying to keep a pulse on some things, like some other districts around us and kind of some traction or maybe not traction that they're getting around some funding sources, because that could help us make some decisions as well. I know we've seen some positives around us for income tax, with Kings, but I also know Fairfield has a large income tax coming up that keeping a pulse on just through their superintendent and some media pieces. So I think that's just a good thing to kind of keep in our mind. So I think as long as we have the option and how much it costs,
Right.
the figure, I think the funding source piece
Right.
can come after that. Option thoughts.
I mean, I've been in all the committee meetings, so I think we've talked our way through to have made the recommendation for these when it came to what we thought there might be acceptance from the community perspective. I mean, clearly we put on the first time what we would ideally like to have. I think this was kind of what we came up with as the best value for what we could do at this time. So I, again, think that they're both viable, but I was leaning towards the C1 at the time, and still am, because I feel like that gives us the academic gains. I think there's benefits to consolidating staff into 2 buildings and the operational savings that would entail, particularly as we continue to see changes on the state level and funding. So I am fond of that because for those reasons, and still believe that is a good compromise that we could potentially get traction with going forward.
I think it's a good compromise because I think it speaks to the people that objected not only to the taxes, but to the people that, I mean, we know we had parents that were not loving the plan, people that have supported us in the past. Again, both viable. I agree with Julie. For me, C1, what's a benefit to me is that it takes Adina offline as well as Creekside, which we know has to go. Creekside and West Freshman. But I have no objections to getting feedback on both of them from the community, and in a way that isn't a vote,
But feedback.
but feedback. Yeah. That's
Yeah, I guess I'll say I had a similar reaction. Just, you get the most bang for your buck with C1. It seems like you address the main concerns that everyone agreed on. You look at our biggest concerns with Adina and Creekside, West Freshman. The only other downside I'll say that I saw to D1, other than it's a little less efficient, is kind of it seems like the new middle schools would be a little bit bigger than that we would be building, as opposed to the ones that would be at East Freshman and Plains. So that might be a little bit of a equity issue, and kind of how do we make sure that all the kids there have all the same options. I know that's always been a struggle to make sure that we can do the best on that regard.
I really liked C1. I agree with Ms. Casper. I think it addressed that question of Adina. Compromise is a good word. I don't think compromise is ever a bad word. But I think Mr. Horton raised a good point. You know, I don't think we just want to settle. I think we want people to love this plan. And just pushing us over the edge to pass might do it in the short term. But I don't just want us to settle for, you know, maybe a plan that's 280 and then come back in a couple of years and say, hey, here's the other half, right? And you know, then people will get really ticked off. I think, you know, maybe we do have a plan that's more than $300 million. But I would agree with Mr. Horton and the concerns that he raised at that February 2nd meeting, that we should be engaging the whole community and not just catering the plan to the 60% that hated last year's plan. Because Lord knows that there is a part in that 60% that won't vote for any plan, right? And I think that there is merit to the idea of, you know, hey, let's try to keep the integrity of what the 40% like, while also maintaining a fiscally responsible, albeit not just the cheapest plan out there.
So what does that look like to you at the next level?
We'll see. I would say that's why we're discussing options. You know, I think, you know, there are concerns, you know, Mr. Horton could probably, you know, talk about what his concerns were, but I think that if we're going on the ballot, the whole board should be in agreement. I know my concerns were more so limited to just the May or November question, but I know Doug had broader concerns, right, about the whole plan. And so I think that when we're looking at November, I want the whole board to love this plan as well. And I want the community to love the plan. And that's why I think it's important. You know, what input do I have on specifics to a plan? Yeah, I wouldn't know, but that's why I think we get you know, now we have the time, which I'm happy that we have the time to engage the community over. But I also know we have the time to engage each other over and get feedback from, you know, everyone in this room and everyone in the community.
So I'll share my perspective, which is, well, let me ask questions. If we go to the community with these options, what are we sharing with them?
So I would envision something like, I mean, the map is up there. I think people need a visual, first of all, to see where buildings are laid out, what buildings are going away. Because when you talk about it, you're like, well, how does that upset my apple cart? Or how does that impact my 20 square feet? And I think we heard a little bit about that in our feedback sessions of, I want to know my building. Like I want to see it. I want to feel it. And I think we would also have to talk about and have some specificity around some of the questions that we had around, maybe not in the engagement piece, but be prepared for what does that mean for busing? What does that mean for potentially attendance zones? Like, so where would a child, if Adina has gotten rid of, where would those children go, and have some hypothetical situations that we could craft that around. I also think cost. I think there would be some questions around cost. They're roughly the same money. They are the same money. So that's, is that a price point that our community can get behind? You know, just from talking to some different folks, I do think there is a price point that this community, it's like the tipping point, right? If it's over this, I don't know if I can get there. If it's under that, I can probably get there, or maybe can get there. So I think price point, I think locations, I do think, and there might be some educational pieces around this as well. And that's where we might need some like informational sessions or things, but you know, what is the difference, or what are the opportunities or pros and cons between 4 junior highs and 2 junior highs? I also think it's not really feedback because it's our funding source. It is what it is. But based on the meeting that we had last night and the 5-year forecast, I don't think that we can be remiss to say this is coming, but there is possibly an operating levy coming as well. I do think people are going to have to grapple with that and figure out where they land in that, because there's a potential bond issue, but there's also an operating piece. You got to keep operating regardless of building buildings, right? And so I think we're going to have to figure out also how to, again, I don't know if it's feedback, because again, that is our funding source currently, as long as property taxes stand, but helping them understand what that means for a taxpayer.
Well, and I think it's important to, sorry, Doug, I'll let you go in a minute, important to what we saw last night and what potentially can come down the pike. We can't cut our way out of that. There's not enough cuts to be made to cut our way out of the money that we could potentially lose. And that's something that I think we have to figure out how to communicate that to the community, because I don't think there is a way based on what Adam was saying last night. Sorry, Doug, you're up.
Oh. So if we go back to the community, I don't feel like we've done much different than what we did in the past year going to the community. We showed them maps, we showed them costs. We had hypotheticals, but not actuals around these questions around busing, attendance zones, what's going to happen to those, if Adena were to be shuttered, what happens to that space? And I think what I feel like we'd just be going back saying, okay, here's a little less buildings, a little less cost. We still don't have the answers for the questions that you asked. And we really are just trying to figure out a price point and pros and cons for two junior highs versus 4 junior highs. And that's my concern, is I don't think we have crafted what we need the solution to deliver, and be willing to commit to a plan that delivers that at the minimum viable solution. So when I look at this and I'm a taxpayer or I'm a parent, I'd want to know, okay, what are the class sizes that we'd be committing to, for instance? I'd want to know, is my 9th grader not going to have busing? Because I can guarantee you, I heard from a ton of families that said, we've normally supported what Lakota does, but I can't lose 9th grade busing. I think we need to understand what educational services we'd be committing to or not. I think the lack of specificity behind the hypotheticals is what led that 40% to be 40% and not 50%. I understand that this is a less cost barrier, but the difference between $500 million and $280 million, I can't really imagine. I would take either of those winning lottery tickets. I don't think one's better than the other, because I can't really fathom the difference between $280 and $500,000. And so yes, there's complexity around how we funded it, but nobody understands funding broadly. They just wanted to kind of know the end bill, but an end bill without any more information against what you're doing sounds like, well, I didn't really like the plan last time, but now that it's cheaper, maybe I'll go for it. And I don't think we get 10%. And I'm frustrated because we've been talking to our community for 1.5 years, and they've been asking these same questions around class sizes, what educational services we're getting delivered, and busing, and what does that mean? And we don't have those answers. So I think we can go back to them, but I think we're going to hear very similar strains to what we've been hearing for the past 1.5 years, and the strains that we've been hearing since November when we touched base with all these community engagements. And I get a little worried because we've been asking our families to engage with us for years now, and we're starting to see them not show up because we're not delivering more answers behind it. And I think we struggled after November to get as much engagement as we wanted to, even from staff. And I think it's because we've been talking the same kind of broad plan, but not answering the specific questions.
I guess my question would be, how specific can we actually get without having all the variables, which we still don't have all the variables. Like, for instance, I think we have a commitment to a class size, but I can't guarantee you that every one of those classes will have that, because I don't know what's going to happen, like what students, we can never predict that, I guess is what we have a benchmark that we know we'd like to meet, and we think, based on everything we've talked about, that this plan would do that class size wise. We also did talk about the educational piece of teachers not traveling and the middle school model. So we have ironed out some of that.
So what class sizes would our parents, or would our families be able to expect with Plan C1 or D1?
Well, I think what's in our policy, the K2, whatever the K5.
I think we would be striving for about 24.
I was gonna say 24, 25.
About 24. Now,
A little more in the upper grades.
and I would even
Whatever our
say,
policy
and this is a
says.
bigger discussion, but, you know, and people have different perspectives of this, but I would take probably a little bit more hit in, like a first grade through a fifth grade to keep kindergarten smaller, right? So kindergarten's just, there's a lot of little bodies in that room doing school for the first time, right? So more like a number of like 21 in kindergarten, which then could increase a little bit in second, third, fourth, fifth grade. But again, you'd be hovering around that 24, 25 rather than that probably 27 that we're sitting at.
So I think we need to specify that out by grade level.
Well,
And I understand that these are goals, right?
Mhm.
And what we're trying to do,
Mhm.
but I don't think we're communicating this to our families in a way that they can understand.
well, and I think there's a complexity here that's getting ready to open on March 1st at noon. And that's ASC forms. ASC forms, alternative school of choice, which is inter-district forms. As I shared last time, we have just, and I'm not saying this is what was shared with you all at the time. We've been grandfathering children in for quite some time. Yes, they filled out a form. It didn't matter. Like you were in it, right? And so I think there are some, if we get those pockets, so if we take all those kids out, look at our enrollment, evaluate that, in addition to the master facilities, those numbers, we can keep a tighter control on those numbers because some buildings, like I'm going to pick on like an Independence or something like that, they've really blossomed because we've let ASC forms kind of push over into that building rather than saying that building is full. You're going to need to go to X building because we've reached our 25 at max before we've taken any ASC forms. We're going to be creating a new baseline of that this year. That communication, as you saw in my update, has gone out just as like a precursor to families. We are reaching out via email to all families who are currently on an alternative school of choice form so that they can't miss it, to know that they do have to fill it out again and kind of things are changing. But we're going to definitely not only have data about enrollment trends around buildings, but also why those ASC forms are being filled out and be able to track those data and make some better decision points. So all of that coupled, we should have a much better grasp on class size per individual building as well, because they're not all the same.
Haven't we already, what should be done with the grandfathering?
So
It should have been,
that
Done,
you're
right?
talking about open enrollment. Open enrollment was grandfathered from 8th grade to seniors, not ASC.
This is
Open
for kids who
enrollment.
are Lakota kids.
Yeah.
right, I know that.
Yeah, open enrollment,
thought we-
remember, yeah,
Right.
that, so those, my understanding, what was always shared with you is that they fill out a new form, and yes, they're kept in the numbers, but we were heavily evaluating those numbers. Well, without you ever taking them out, you don't know where you're starting. Do you know what I mean? You don't know your neighborhood kids. You've got your neighborhood kids plus all your intra-district kids, and so it was creating some very heavy pockets. So, for example, I'm going to pick on Independence again. Let's say I was starting in the 4th grade with 27 children there with ASC forms and neighborhood kids, and I continue to get neighborhood kids. That number just keeps going up because I've never said no to any ASC form pockets. So again, this year I think Aaron has like 25 emails and just say like, wait a minute, what does that mean for my kid? It means we're evaluating everything starting from scratch. We're going to pull out the numbers, look at it, do sectioning, and then start to build staffing models around that before ASC forms ever go in, and then we'll plot those accordingly.
So we don't have to honor
No,
those.
no, that's what,
Just depends
that
on
is what we are saying in
saying.
writing. Like everything is going from, we're taking you out, we will evaluate each situation and see if that building can actually hold additional kids besides the neighborhood kids. And some of them will not be able to.
And do we have people, I believe I heard this, do we have people that, pick on Independence, that buy a house in Independence to attendance zone, but they're like, no, I want to go to Van Gordon.
Oh, absolutely. So currently, we have in the past, the new stipulation is that if you are a new enrollee to Lakota Local Schools, at least for the first year, You cannot fill out an ASC form. You will attend your neighborhood school. You should give your neighborhood school a good fighting chance to make sure it's a good fit for you. Again, I'm going to use my own child. We live near Liberty Junior. Could I have sent her to Hopewell or could I have sent her to Plains yes, but that's our neighborhood school. But yes, we do have quite a few new enrollees that do not attend their neighborhood school the first time that they buy a house. So we're putting some parameters around that as well. But 24, to answer your question, 24 to 25.
To Doug's point, is it possible to get some of that data around these options?
Well, we would have,
Other than the class, like, I know the attendance zone thing is a big study.
so, well, and I do think, you know, we've received emails that I think when you have a new facilities plan and you're looking at busing, I don't know if opportunity is the right word. There's an opportunity to relook at attendance zones to make sure that they make sense and that they're the most efficient that they can be. I'm not sure that in the last, I don't know, I can't define it, that we've done that with Fidelity to really look at, are the buses taking I think that is an opportunity in busing to look at those routes, and we are looking at those routes with Doug and Doug Palmer to make sure that they're efficient. There's a difference between a route and it being the most efficient route.
Is
Like,
Oh, go ahead.
but attendance zones, I think we all know this. You can always change attendance zones.
Right.
People have feelings when you do that.
Right.
Right. So I think we just have to make sure that you look at levers accordingly and which ones you're going to change to make sure that it's the most efficient, but also understanding your community and your stakeholders and how they feel about that and the drastic changes that can be made sometimes in those situations.
Sorry.
If I take my board hat off and I put my parent hat on, or what if we just rezoned and made spread out kids across our existing buildings? I don't know if I vote to increase my property tax by $280 million, then will I have busing or not for my ninth grader? I think that's where we need answers to these questions instead of suggestions of what might happen, because those were the questions that I remember getting asked in all those community sessions that we sat through. And I think we alluded to this, but we didn't have firm answers. And so I think if we need to wait till after March to understand how the new alternative school of choice impacts things, I think that's worth looking at. I think we haven't done any look at what if we did if we just moved people to other buildings and what that looked like.
Do you mean make them all like K5s, or do you mean like just stop ASC forms?
What I don't have visibility to as a board member is I see some of our schools have capacity and some of our schools don't have capacity. I can't understand what is the minimum viable solution to hit that class size. And is it all of this building, or is it, hey, we need 3 elementary schools and we rezone east-west and suddenly we're in an okay situation? Because I haven't seen a plan that details what that looks like. And I think we have assumptions that we are going to ask our taxpayers for property taxes and our other constituents that would be very upset about getting rezoned to a new school. We're not even looking at that option. And I'm using this as an extreme. I don't think we're going to solve the solution with just rezoning, but there may be a hybrid example that doesn't cost as much, that gets us part of the way and starts earning the trust of our constituency. So that way we can do this in more segments instead of basically from 1 to 2. My big concern is that if we were to put C1 and D1 on there and we do get it approved, then when it comes time to actually do the rest of the work, we're not going to be able to do that work. And I know that there's an assumption that we're going to make all these K5s, but these plans don't have any costs for retrofitting those schools from K2 and 3-5 to K through 6. And I remember when we changed some of the elementary schools to ESC, there was a ton of things that happened that weren't accounted for. And we still have some
Heritage, you see that at Heritage.
Yeah, Heritage is an example of that. We still have things that don't work. And so I get very concerned that this is a premature plan that doesn't have a viable way for us to get the rest of the way done. We're just basically trying to get something done early. And I think there's other ways to approach that by looking at broadening the options before us. $280 million is still a lot of money. And that property tax sentiment in our community is still what it was last year. I don't know how, if we say instead of $95 per $100,000 of assessed value and we come back with $50 of assessed value, I don't know how that changes the narrative 10%.
I guess there's a couple things, just kind of hearing your concerns that I wanted to talk about. And one of them is, I think you said people don't really understand the difference between like a $580 million plan and a $280 million plan, or whatever the specific amounts is. I think what they care about the most is, how does this impact me? And I think that was the biggest concern about, I think, like last time, was when we were trying to communicate this and get this out to people, is we couldn't get past that cost piece. But I think the benefit of like C1 and D1 is that how that impacts me is pretty clear. My taxes are going to stay about the same and maybe go down based, depending on, some of the ancillary things that we have. And I think that is a kind of incredibly important thing that changes that for people who are trying to decide, okay, do I vote for this or not? Another thing that I heard people saying was, well, Heritage we built 30 years ago. My house is older than 30-year-old. Why are we getting rid of it? Same with Freedom or whatever. We've taken all of that out of the equation. So I think we can get into some of the more of these benefits that we couldn't even get to, because this is less of a plan. It's more simple. One thing that I would like to see as we try to communicate, if we go with plans like these, is kind of what that impact was, or would look like for the rezoning of the K-5 buildings. Because I don't think people realize, like, when you go from 3 or 4 elementary schools on your side of the district to like 8, like how that affects, like, it's more of a community-based school and things like that. And we may not have the exact attendance zone, but I think that's something that you could show visually, potentially, to people, though. This is a draft, and it's very tricky once you start putting drafts out there, because, I'm a parent and I want to know the answers to all those questions too. But I think some of the things that you're saying are kind of more how do we communicate this to people potentially than what is the actual plan. And I think the simplicity of this plan versus what we had before really allows us to communicate more of those benefits, I think, to people. So I think that'll go a long way to helping us move forward. That's one thing that, as I sat in all these meetings and was looking through all of this data, that I was like, oh yeah, we can actually get to some of that stuff where it says it's the biggest plan that's ever been put out there, or all of those things that we just couldn't get past at all. Oh, my taxes are going to be about the same, or they might go down. Okay, let's talk about all this other stuff. So
I would, sorry.
Go ahead.
I would agree with Mr. Argo. Definitely, I think, I like I said, I love this plan, primarily because it is that compromise, and you can sell it as a tax decrease, right? It's an incremental tax decrease. And, having conversations with some of the circles that I have conversations with, people who were really against last year's plan, myself included, now this is an incremental tax decrease that, in my mind, does answer a lot of the concerns that we had. That's something that I think opens people up to, like Mr. Argo was saying, getting into the weeds of those other conversations. Last year's plan, the cost, it shut off a lot of ears. People weren't even receptive to the other different ins and outs because of the cost, and that cost was a gate to, what was a wall, and people were not willing to see past, what are the other things that this plan has to offer. I think now that we've addressed the cost, now that we've addressed, now that this is potentially an incremental tax decrease, people are going to be more receptive to, okay, what are the other things that this addresses? And then to your point, we can answer, now that we have till November, rather July, now we can answer the other concerns with busing, with class size, etc. But I think because now this is an incremental tax decrease, you're going to see a lot more of the community, 10% shift. more than 10% shift, I would say, that are going to be a lot more receptive to what does this master facilities plan have to offer. My concern, pretty much my sole concern would be, is this going to be, I know you can't really have a one and done capital improvements plan, right, as decades go by, but ideally, you'd have this capital improvement plan and, in my mind, you wouldn't go back for 4 years with another capital improvement plan, something to that effect.
Yeah, I guess I feel like what we heard the most was cost. So it was what I heard was cost, complexity, and the age of buildings, as you mentioned. So I think the age of buildings that were being taken offline and not doing renovations, but doing new builds. So I do agree that it would be interesting to explore what we might be able to do from a renovation perspective and putting some dollars in order to make sure that we retrofit those buildings so that perhaps there wouldn't need to be a second phase if we could simply do, because you're pulling out all those sixth graders, so you've freed up that space. If you've done some more minor renovations, since you've taken Adina and Creekside, the two worst offenders, offline anyway, I do think that there's an opportunity there to make sure that we can deliver and then again revisit if we would ever even want to do more. I think there is that possibility not to need to do more because you've freed up space and done not ideal renovations, but enough to get you that K-5 model. But I do think, I also think we have to be a little bit careful. While we all like everything to be black and white and crystal clear, I think now that we're going through the busing proposal, we have to be somewhat cautious on what we can commit to and what we can't, because what we think we're going to be able to commit to, if things don't go as we anticipated, then we all know that we already have a credibility issue with the community. The worst thing we could do is say we're going to be able to deliver X, and we may have a very good reason why we can't deliver X, but all that we're going to hear is, you told me you were going to deliver X, you did not deliver X, and I can never trust you again. We already run into that in different things. So while I appreciate the desire to have everything perfectly clear, I think unfortunately we have to live with a working towards, which I feel like is what we've been doing. We're working towards the class sizes that match our policy of the 25, 23, 22. We're working towards, what the busing options were. Because again, I think we were all ready to say we could do K-12, and then we got proposals back and are like, yeeks, I don't know that that's feasible given the changes in the state structure that are also happening, or the state budget. So while all of us ideally would love that, I don't know if it's practical or wise, with the potential to then have us not be able to deliver what we promised. And I think that's also a fear factor for me.
I'm not saying we overpromise, but what I want to make sure everyone realizes is that given where we are with that process and where we are in that process, we are not leaning forward and saying there's K through 12 busing in this model, which means ninth grade busing goes away. And I want to reiterate that because
We haven't said that.
Mm-mm.
We haven't said that we're not doing K-12 busing.
Right now in the proposals, ninth grade busing is just there,
It's there.
and so is 10th grade.
ninth and 10th grade
Yeah.
is in this.
In the current proposals that we are looking at, ninth and 10th grade are there, that we are
I
trying.
understand, but we haven't gotten there
No,
yet.
we haven't got, no, but
So
that's
my-
what we're trying to work.
I
out.
understand that, but that's my point. We're not there yet. But so if that is unsuccessful, then what we are doing by putting this in front of our community is to say that those ninth grade facilities go away and that busing will not go to the high schools. And that's exactly the situation that we were doing in November, which means that as parents, I'm not solving for anywhere from 3 months to 8 months of not being able to figure out or having to figure out a ride for my student, but fully a year and a half, potentially to almost 2 years of getting my student to school at a time when our district is 30% economically disadvantaged. And I think it's easy for us when we have our kids who drive themselves to school or have friends that drive themselves to school to underestimate the impact and how many families we lost in that election because of that issue. And so that's my point, is until we have some better certainty around this to reassure our voters, by starting with the high schools in the manner that we're doing, we are automatically, as a default, unless something changes in the next couple months, which is hard to get feedback on when we don't have those answers, is to say that, yeah, you're going to lose ninth grade busing. That's one of the issues we had in November. We don't have a better answer for that now, versus looking at other alternatives that don't necessarily address that. We are starting with this because of operational savings. How much operational savings are these plans going to deliver for us?
I think that depends on if we have 2 buildings or 4 buildings and which ones we take offline. I think that's one of the, and at least in the community feedback, operational savings did not, at least in the feedback that we got in that 2 weeks, it did not quite rank as high as maybe it would internally. But I do think as far as staffing efficiency and just maintenance of buildings, C1 has more potential for operational savings than D1, just because there's less footprint.
When we look at our November option, that was designed to save us $12 million annually,
Yeah.
which was designed to forego the operational levy that's now in our 5-year forecast. I'm assuming it's less than $12 million in this plan. We don't have a number, but if it's less than $12 million, means we still have to figure out how do we get operational starting in 2029. I appreciate that there's ways we can sell this as a tax decrease, but 2 years later, going back and saying that we need an operational levy after we did a tax decrease, I think runs into the same situation that you're alluding to, Julie, which is, wait, you told us we're getting a tax decrease and now you're coming back and saying you're gonna have to close schools or RIF teachers or whatever it is. I think we have to be very careful with how we sequence this out and what feedback we get from the community, because as a parent, I'll be like, oh, I like the smaller schools. I want the 4 schools. Okay, great. And it's tax decrease. Great. Okay. And then I'll look up and my favorite teacher is getting riffed in 2 years and I'll feel betrayed.
I think the reality is, however, we don't have a crystal ball. I mean, we can gather the data that we can. To Julie's point, assumptions more than direct. But my concern is we can, for lack of a better way to say this, we are under a time crunch because we are throwing good money after bad in some of these buildings. And we are seeing things like, I'll use Cherokee as an example, that is busting at the seams and will continue to bust at the seams. I don't feel like this is at least a foundation to start some of these conversations. I don't feel like we have the ability to start over, to come up with a new plan. I think we have to figure out what we can do within the plans that we've discussed that will get us some of this relief that we need, because again, accountability to the taxpayers is also not continuing to band-aid some of these buildings and wasting taxpayer money. And that's my concern, is that I feel like we have to start somewhere. And maybe we don't have, to Julie's point, maybe we don't have to go back. We have said from the beginning that with these 2 plans, the next phase, if there is to be a next phase, is really up to the community. What do you want? Do you want brand new spanking all K-5 buildings? Do you want some of the things? Let the community be the driver of some of the things that they want, rather than us putting together what we thought was a great plan, which I still believe it was, but it was very cost prohibitive. So that's my concern, is that if you look at a timeline that says we have to have a decision on some of these by July 6th, and we want to engage our community, we have to figure out how to get started on that. And I don't know.
What is your proposed timeline if we're able to get some of the data in at least a broad sense without specificity on this plan?
I don't have a timeline because the November ballot issue that we put out there was the one that elegantly solved all the solutions, right? It got us the operational savings, it got us everything we needed, and it got us in a time frame that we would be able to forego an operational levy.
Right.
Without that solution, this is not delivering on those. And that's my concern. So I don't have a timeline because right now I don't know how I go to the voters in November or spring or this spring or whenever it was and say, we really need these buildings. And then in 2 years, go for an operational levy that we haven't even set up a discussion for them with. And we still don't have answers to the questions that they have. So I understand that there's a timeline. We need to address all our aging facilities. Absolutely. We have other priorities as well, which is staying fiscally solvent through 2030.
So
And
if,
this doesn't deliver that. So that's my concern.
okay, so for me, I believe that we're talking more the facilities piece. I agree that our community is not going to like, and I've said this before, if we build the buildings, but then we're riffing teachers, so then we can't get to class sizes, we have gotten nowhere other than I think we've gotten backwards in some regards, in my opinion. So I do believe that this needs to include, at this point, given the changes we just saw in legislation and the changes in the 5-year forecast, for me, whatever plan we go forward does have to address some of those operating pieces, not as a phase 2, but at this time, because I don't want to build a new building and not be able to staff it appropriately and have those people. I believe that the plan we put together needs to combine both of those pieces when we look at the 5-year forecast. Because to me, it's disingenuous to say that we're going to be able to answer that primary question, which is the whole reason we even want to do this. I mean, it's the educational soundness, but also that class size piece is significant.
And maybe that's what needs to happen is
And
we need to
aging.
bring these two things together and have an honest conversation with our community about not just buildings and not just about 2 years, but the
Right.
next 5 years
Right.
and what that looks like.
And I think that's a great point because so strategic planning will open up some community engagement opportunities beyond that. So you have the strategic planning of just the plan, like dreaming the next version of ourselves. Very abstract, right? It's very big. It's supposed to be a very big umbrella. It's supposed to capture lots of things. And you get that and you have that guiding star document. But then the engagement is, what does that mean to this community? So I'm just gonna pick some buzzwords, right? And I'm not saying this is what our strategic plan, but when you say future ready, what does that mean? Does that mean world languages? Does that mean an expanded cyber community? What does that mean? And I think that is where your community says what is important, right? So again, if we have a strategic plan that says whole child, music's gonna come up, art's gonna come up. And I think if you have a community that says, I want specials for all K-6 and I want a orchestra and a band and a choir program that starts in the 6th grade, then you go, that's fabulous. Here's what it costs. This is this many mills and an operating levy that it would cost you to deliver that. Like, so I think there's like some pieces of that because I do think there's operating as we know it. And then there's operating, I think in our mind of the next version of ourselves where we have additional offerings and additional student opportunities. And I think we have to be, I think we would really want to engage our community to say, we heard you loud and clear, you want this. This is how much money it costs you in terms of millage and taxes and operating. I'm trying to take it out of bond, but operating levies. Like we can do the status quo that we're doing, but if we want to see specials return, if we want to see that, this is what that looks like operationally. But I think part of that clunkiness right now is we couldn't even offer those things if we want to, because we don't have any space to offer them in. Right? So if you talk, I mean, we don't have any class, like if somebody said tomorrow, implement primary world language, I can do that. We don't have any classrooms. We can do it on a cart, I guess, but we don't really have any classrooms or staffing for that. So I think there's the educational piece and the space piece. I agree. And I think strategic planning, once that document is done, that big umbrella, then you get into those really nuanced conversations and you're able to have some really concrete sayings of our community wants X. Okay, here's what it costs. Well, we want that all. Okay, well, here's what that costs. And you can really give people the option to vote. I want that. Right? Or, okay, if you took out the 2 options, what would it cost? Okay, well, I like that. It's kind of the good, better, best of educational offerings.
Adam, what was the total millage of the planned operational levy in your 5-year forecast?
3.6 mils.
But if because again, this was intriguing to me when you brought it up the first time at the, I don't know, one of the board meetings recently, of the income tax instead of a bond issue, or instead of, the regular bond. That if we did that, it could potentially fund both pieces. It can fund an operational piece as well as fund the debt service on the bonds, because the excess can go to operations. And so if we set it up for, again, potentially say a 1%, making that up, it could potentially give us the like it would fulfill that need of your operating levy.
That's correct. Yeah, it has a, when you're looking at to debts on facilities, we were bound to 25% increments, 0.25% increments. It didn't have exactly the flexibility of the 12th increments, I believe it is. But yeah, it's any type of an income tax is general fund revenues. It would then be general fund debt. That's where the COPS issue would be. Viewed as a little bit more of an expensive today option to finance, just because it's viewed as a little bit riskier. However, it's general fund revenues that debt would then show up in the forecast as well as those revenues.
Then it also cost our taxpayers more, correct, in income tax?
Yeah, today it's a higher percentage.
Yeah.
Typically,
And
I
it
believe
pays it. I mean, it depends on who
about
pays it
20,
too.
about 0.25%, I believe, is what they had estimated that to be.
But as a like, I would pay more than I would if it were a bond issue.
Than you would in property taxes,
Yeah.
yes. But there'd be a whole lot of people who were very against it because of the property tax issue that wouldn't pay. Because if we did it on earned income tax, retirees wouldn't have to pay that
Social
tax.
Security,
Right, but our-
pensions.
Right.
But our
And
family,
it's
our
just-
young
so,
family.
so,
They don't.
and that's some of the stories that we've heard that were most compelling is, you know, with property taxes and everything that's going on with property taxes, any additional burden on property tax was difficult for people who don't have an earned income. This is a way to avoid that.
Forgo them.
And when we look at getting a consensus across the community, this is what excites me, right? We're starting to get things that people will vote for, which is, okay, I can get on board because I support the schools and it's not going to get me kicked out of my house. Okay, I want specials and I need the buildings to go along with it. We're changing the dynamic from what the conversation was. And then the price tag is what are we getting for it instead of 500 million feels too much. So, but I can go 260, 280.
I think that depends. That would have to be a whole education conversation because you've now switched the burden from the seniors to your young families who may not be able to afford it because it does cost more than a bond, than a property tax. And who knows? I'm not saying I'm against it. I'm just saying we got to be careful not to flip it to the.
Well, we could do a blend. I mean, we could do a property tax and income to help balance it and balance the load. I know there was examples in districts that were much more rural where they had gone down looking at property taxes, and the residents were like, "This is crazy. We're paying all this, and all the industrial, all the commercial agriculture land aren't paying to keep the facilities." So they actually did a blended rate to make it balanced across the stakeholders.
What date is that one? The blended date. When's that?
Well,
go?
but again, I mean,
I
I
believe
think
the 21st.
Yeah. Just look at
Right.
I mean, when you look at how the state has shifted funding, this is where, like, this is what has swayed me. If you look at, and I meant to look it up before the meeting and I forgot to, the decrease in our state income tax. Each year, the legislature has rolled that back for the last several years. In so doing, they've shifted a lot of the burden for those expenses over to schools and local government. And so that has caused those entities to raise the property taxes. So we've seen a shift where it used to be more of a blend of the state income tax funding portions and a local property tax funding portions. As they've decreased that property or the income tax, we've had to increase property taxes. So that to me is, we would still say, again, you did charge a 1% income tax. People would still be paying, for the most part, depending on your bracket, a lower income tax than they were 5 years ago if you looked at the rate of income tax in the state. So even with that, it's a bit of a rebalancing from what we've seen at the state level and what has gotten us to where everyone is so up in arms about property taxes right now that there's been the rebellion that we've seen. So it would be us doing a little bit of what the state hasn't done with shifting the burden all to property versus income.
Yeah, I think when you have any one of those taxes, whether it's sales or property or income, that's heavily one way or the other. That's when people start getting mad about that tax, and we get into all sorts of issues. If you look at what Kings did, Adam may have mentioned it earlier. I think they did like a 1.5%. I think was it earned income tax, and it generated like the equivalent of like 8 point something mils of property tax, and they had some rolling off, and their community felt like that was a good balance to kind of move them forward. I am kind of worried that we're trying to solve all of our problems at once and then they'll be done, because we know that is impossible. I think we need to figure out, all right, what gets us better so that we can continue this process. And I don't want to do something that's irresponsible or can put us in a worse place. But I guess to me, the question is this what we think the best is from a facilities standpoint? And then we can continue to have these conversations about how do we handle the operating piece before we say, all right, this is what our ballot issue is going to look like, so that we can continue to have those conversations. I guess that's what my big question is right now is, are we trying to couple busing with it? Are we trying to couple all those things? Because obviously if we say, oh, we want to fix all those things, they told us no in November. We can't fix all of the facilities things at once. And so, well, if we fix X, Y, and Z all at once, we're going to be at a similar price point. Can we do that all at once? And I think part of what the taxpayers told us was we want to see an incremental approach. In my mind, they are saying, we don't trust you right now. So take an incremental approach. We'll gain some trust, and then we can continue the conversation. I don't know what that ask looks like right now, but I think we have got a couple good options as far as this is how we move the facilities forward, and we have until May or July to figure out what do those other pieces look like.
Do we have a minimum millage amount for like C1, D1 plus anything to forego an operating levy?
Ask me that in a different way.
So this C1 is 2.12, 2.11, right? Something like that.
Okay.
And then operating you have is 3.6, right? That's 5.8, 5.72. Last year's plan was 4.9, right? The 2.15 plus 2.66.
Okay.
But people were already playing. If we do the operating levy, it's bigger than even last year's plan, right? On top of the capital improvements. Is there a way to forego an operating levy, have this plan, and not come close to the 4.99 mils that we had last year?
What we would have to do is we'll have to get the staffing estimates pulled together so that we know where that new model could bring us together. Other things that we could do is you could look, I know you're thinking about this on a longer period of time, you could look into combinations of it. You could look into letting some of the millage come off, putting some on, supplementing with some income tax, perhaps, different ways. Also then could come in if we do it with if it was general funded, then we could work on the timing of the debts. Like we were going to work on to wait for the millage roll off to happen. You could work on that again to help. One of the big years that we have is bridging the gap to when our TIFs come back for Union Center Boulevard as well as Voice of America, to figure out if there's ways that we could use some of that to bridge to 32, 33 to then hopefully be able to, because I don't think anybody here wants to overcollect on anything.
Right.
We want to have a plan. We want to make sure that then we can unite the plan with a funding source and it just be right, kind of like the building sizes and everything else.
I think you have to be careful with, because what you just said there sounds confusing again. That was the other thing we heard besides the cost was it has to be simple. We have to be able to understand it. We start doing that and we're going to lose people again.
But a plan like that doesn't necessarily mean going to the voters with all of those asks, right? It's sequencing our plans over the next 7 years to get us to the TIF roll-offs and what that would mean. And there's a lot that you could do that would be a replacement. Well, not, it wouldn't be a replacement levy, but replacing the millage that's falling off, right? So it doesn't look like a tax increase, but it's just keeping us whole, bridges us over, maybe does a portion of this, whether it's C, D, 1, or just a couple schools, and then think through what that looks like long term. That's, I think, a more compelling story to talk to our community and then let them know what to expect is that, hey, now it's not 2.1 for this and 3.66 in 2028, but it looks like, 2.1 now and 1.7 or whatever it would look like. I think that's where we need to have that idea of how we're going to get through 2032.
Yeah, there's many options that we can figure out on the financing side, but keeping the conversation as much not about finances as possible
Right,
is going to be helpful.
right. We need to.
It needs to be programming. It needs to be, I've said this to somebody before that football is not a moneymaker. We don't really have any programs that are profitable here at all. They're not. So because of that, it's not about the money as to why we have football. It's about what it does for the community. It's about what it does for our students.
Yeah, that reminds me of a story when I was in college. I grew up in Texas, and Texas football is Texas football. And Katy High School, I believe it was, put a ballot or put a measure on the ballot for a $61 million football stadium. And everyone laughed, like, $61 million, that is ridiculous for a football stadium. And it failed miserably.
Oh, did it? I was going to say in Texas.
6 months later, they said, we heard you, and it's now 54 million, not 61 million, and we're going to host the state tournament, the state championship.
And they love
Passed
that.
with flying colors. And it tells you, like, people vote for something that they want. And
Football
they
is
care about money, but sometimes they care about hosting the state championship. And so, again, I think we need to think through what that looks like.
So,
And to be clear, we do not have a $51 million stadium in this plan. C1 correct?
no, sorry.
We'll
So
make sure that's not
with,
the case.
I guess I would ask you, with some of the things that you're asking, if we could get some, we're not going to get concrete answers. We're not going to tell you exactly how many kids are going to be in a class. We could look at the zoning. And we talk about creative financing. So can you get behind one of these?
I think it's all of this in totality. Right now I don't want to go with an option to C1 and D1 that doesn't answer whether or not we're going back to them in 2 years, because that needs to be part of this conversation. Because November was, this is going to be what solves our operating levy issue. That's a huge communication point. If this doesn't solve, which I don't think we have any indication that it would, there's another operating levy coming in 2028. We need to have that conversation at the same time, at least. And that needs to be part of whatever we put in front of them if we're getting any feedback. So,
Yeah, to Doug's point, I would hate to, and also Julie's, I would hate to have this plan and then come back 3 years and say, actually, we're coming back with an operating levy that if you do the math, the millage is more than even the, last year's plan.
But we know we need something and we know we have to figure that out. So I guess the question is, do we do that now? Or do we do that in 3 years?
I think we can do both. I think that we can ask ourselves the question, we can come up with a plan that, at least like Doug said, maybe come operating levy is not a full 3.6 plan, but strategically phase it to a degree so that we're not throwing a full 5.7 or
Yeah, I have no desire to do
4.99 mil on them at once. 'Cause
Yeah.
they're not going to approve that.
Yeah, we know that from history.
I think with a strategic plan, you can have the conversation about what this community wants. And right now, and I'm just, and this is me speaking, the strategic plan is outdated, right? It just is. It's outdated. It's old. We need to refresh it. We need to revitalize it. It's not reflecting our community because it does, but it's not a fresh perspective of where we currently are. Right? I think once we have that, then the conversation is, because that operating levy that Adam has, forecasted is our model right now.
Right.
Right? I mean, that's not bringing specials back. That's
Right.
not doing any of those things. And I think we can dream and dream and dream, but I think it's helping a community say specials takes priorities over busing, or music takes priority over world night. Like it's prioritizing those things and putting a figure by each of those to then say, when you get to that 3-year mark of an operating levy, this is what a meal will get you. These are the 3 things 2 meals will get you. These are the 5 things that 3 meals will get you, and help them see that kind of buffet approach of what is my money getting me educationally, right? Because the only way to increase programming in the current operating model that's forecasted, to increase programming, you're going to have to reduce it somewhere else. You're stealing from Peter to pay Paul.
Right.
And
Redistribution of
right,
programming.
right. And nobody feels like they're getting anything in that. You're just, like you said, you're just redistributing it and go, but somebody goes, well, you got
Deploying
it, but
the troops in a different way.
right. And I don't think that's where we want to be, because somebody still feels like they lost something in that regard. We want to be, we're maintaining and growing a program. And I do think after we have that strategic plan, and again, the goal is to start fresh, like have that strategic plan in place to start the 26-27 school year, to say, this is what you told us you want. Now let's really delve into those buckets or those pillars and really flesh that out as a community.
Well, and not only what do you want educationally, but we have a portion of our community that doesn't have children in school. So we have to make them understand what a value it is for them to have a strong public school system. And, okay, I don't know where to go from here. I'm like, does anybody have any suggestions? Because I do worry, like, a strategic plan for the 26-27 school year needs to be done yesterday.
Well, it's going to be started this spring.
Okay.
I mean,
So-
yeah, I mean, it'll probably start, the community engagement piece will probably start in March. We would have heavy community engagement in March, April, and May, to have all of that, so that then we can draft and hone the graphic and the model and everything to be able to launch the school year with that.
So, but again, if we want to go on the ballot in November, we have to have something before that, I'm concerned, and I agree that we need to do this, but if we need community engagement for so many things. At what point do we burn these people out? And they're like, we're not going to one more thing. And so that's my concern, is how we,
But will they, go ahead.
I'll share my perspective. I would rather go on a ballot next spring or a year from now or 2 years from now with something that would pass and deliver the vision for the district that our community wants, versus just putting something on the ballot that's going to fail again in November.
if we do that, we lose programming, we lose staff. Dr. Whiteley's already said that. We lose all-day kindergarten, we lose specials, we will have to rip
Is that in the
staff.
26-27 staff? Is that in the 26-27 plan?
It is not in the 26-27 plan. It would be in the 27-28 plan.
Yeah. And so
So we
there's-
need to get busy on the strategic plan and solve this, because I don't know how this necessarily solves that. Because we still have the operating levy issue in 2028.
But to Alex's point, this is a start. We have to start somewhere. This gets us facilities that aren't hemorrhaging money. It gets us smaller class sizes because we've moved kids out of the elementary into the middle schools. This does give us some of the things that we need and some of the things that the community has asked us. It doesn't get us everything, but it does solve some of our problems.
If we
So
wait
many
to solve all the
offenses.
problems, then it's going to cost more, and we're going to have a harder time convincing everyone to do it. I think we know we can't solve all of our problems at once, so we need to pick. I think we need to pick some problems to solve now, and continue to work those other problems. And it seems like this problem right here continues to get more expensive at a faster rate than these other problems do.
If we're talking
Yeah.
about $1 million a month, is that correct, Tom? $1 million a month increase in our plan. If you wait 24 months,
So
that's a lot more money that we're asking for.
if you remember the 4 big buckets, the ones that even exist before I was here, right? That we re-engaged the community with to say, are these still valid?
Oh,
Grade band, class size, safety. It's not called future ready. I can't remember the word. It was not called future ready. And what? Thank you. I was like, what was it called? 3 out of 4 of those are not programming.
Right.
3 out of 4 of those are simply space and reconfiguring. Now, it doesn't mean that the community is not saying, I'm the educational person. Like, you get me jazzed about programming, right? But three of these four things are saying we're out of space. We need facilities. We need some relief. And then we want to make sure that the programming enhances that and capitalizes on that. But I don't know if you're going to get all four at one time without some delay. I'm not saying that's right or good or bad. I'm just putting that out there. That
Delay
three,
or really large spend,
right.
more than what our last ask was.
Because you could get 3 out of the 4, do strategic planning, have that engage for a year and a half, 2 years before we get to that operating levy, so that we can have, this is what it's going to, like, again, here's our buffet. What would you like for our children, for them to be future ready, innovative pieces, and how can we put millage to that to see what our community wants to do?
I think
I'd like to challenge us to move faster than 2 years to figure out what our community wants this
Well,
district to be like.
No, I think, yeah, after
we
we have
need that
this-
answer by next year.
No, I agree.
I think we need to have the operating a part of the discussion, even for November.
Mhm.
I don't think that we can sneak that up on the
No, I agree.
community in 20,
No, we can't.
28.
Even if we don't put it on there,
Right.
we need to talk about it.
We need to let them know that
And the depth of
this,
that.
right,
I
this
think-
might be 2.11,
Mhm.
2.12, but there's a potential for
Mhm.
3.6 operating.
There's all kinds of opportunities about this is how school funding works in Ohio, and no matter what we want to do, there's no way to fix all of our problems right now. And
And it would also
They need
require
to know
fixing
that.
the state. 'Cause
I know we
But
can't fix
I
every.
want us to not take a cynical approach at this. This is the environment that we're in, and we need to solve these problems. At the end of the day, we have one of the lower spending per pupils of our competitive districts and our neighboring districts. We also have one of the lowest effective tax rates. And so I get the fact that nobody loves taxes. I don't love taxes either. But where am I going to go that's going to pay less? That I'm going to pay less in taxes than I am for the educational quality that we're getting in this district. And I think those are ways we can dimensionalize this discussion with our community. That's one of the reasons we're in the problem, the issue that we're in right now. We have not gotten increased funding since 2013 because we've managed to make things work. But we didn't bring back all the services that people wanted back from 2010. We've seen what we're doing to cut costs and kind of keep it going. We're at the point where we're going to have honest discussions with our constituency about this.
And I think to Doug's point, you hear it's compared sometimes to places, right? I do think people need to see what a music program costs and what a community is paying for that. What specials cost and what a community is paying for that. What primary world language and what people are paying for that. Like those come at a cost, right? And so I think it was one of our trustees who said, like, show me their millage, their student achievement. Like, you can see the correlation there. I'm not saying always, but you will see a trend for sure of kind of high performing districts, investments, and the programming that they're able to offer because they're tied.
How long does a strategic plan typically take to develop and create?
And be it long or short as you want. What I mean by that is, I've seen probably not schools, but like if you're talking more corporate, 18 to 24 months. School, I would say anywhere from 4 months to a year, depending on the district.
Do you have an estimate for
I think if
what would be ready to go for?
if we started in March, I think we could be ready to go by August.
So do we think that,
Meaning out the door, printed, like,
do you think that we have some things that we can work on to get some,
well, so busing, Craig and I have a meeting on Friday. Busing decision was supposed to be made the first week of February. We're still working those numbers. We are committed to making sure that those numbers fit what is forecasted. They fit efficiency. They fit our needs, and our needs being that we're not decreasing busing, that we at least have what we have, if not a little more. Might not be
Right.
K-12, but we're trying to get the 10th grade in there, but we're not looking to decrease busing. That's been a very iterative process. I'll say that. We're going to continue to iterate through that. So that we should have very, very shortly. The capital plan meetings are next March 4th. That's why I was like, they're all day. So we should be having that data so that we can see the long-term needs of all of the buildings, so we can have that in front of you. I'd say by the end of March, 1st of April is what they've anticipated. We can certainly, we have some preliminary numbers on things of like, what it would cost, or staffing wise, what it would cost to introduce specials, what it would cost to, do some world language pieces, and so that we have some of that preliminary data. I think we've also talked about some opportunities to, proactively look at savings that don't impact, they impact the program minimally, that we've talked about. So we can look at some of those as well. But yeah, I think we can
So
add some of those pieces.
we have a facilities meeting on March 10th.
Mhm.
So my recommendation would be that maybe we come with some of those details that we have. I feel very strongly, and I know it's a lot, we have to do more of these meetings because we can't get everybody to the facilities meeting. I think that it's hard for us to convey to Doug or to Ben, who aren't here, what was, I can take copious notes, but it's hard to,
We can make this a standing issue at our board meetings every month.
yes. But I feel like sometimes that's only monthly. Well, I guess we do have work sessions.
I think the problem with work session is, so Ben, do you have a conflict at work
Ben has a
sessions?
conflict with work sessions.
Usually, I'd only be there for about 30 minutes.
So I feel
We'd
like,
at least be touching base with the whole board once a month. More than we're doing now.
I just feel like if we want to move it make any decisions.
There's lots of things we're talking about here, and I don't think Tom is going to have any answers for what our programming looks like.
Right.
We need to figure out how to compartmentalize these different discussions and say, what can we do here to support all that stuff in the most flexible way possible without having to have the answer to every single question.
Right.
Well, and I also think, and we've not had this conversation, and we have a planning meeting certainly to come up. We talked about in our retreat the other day about academic, our student achievement, academic excellence. I'm sure each of you have a different definition of what that looks like. And then you had my definition in there, Mr. Zink's definition in there. I say
I'm an
that.
educator.
But you're about to have school age children.
But what I'm saying is, it might be
About to have an
helpful
opinion.
to pull the data that and I know we wouldn't want community input for sure, right? But if I can just, I can pick 10 low-hanging fruit. I call them low-hanging fruit. They're not low-hanging fruit, and say, how would we prioritize these? Counselors, specials,
Right.
central, world language, cyber, STEM. I can keep going. Career force readiness. If you want figures, we have to prioritize that, because to your point, you can't do all those. There's no budget big. There's no budget big enough. And so specials, like I said, I can bring the specials data, but you might say, that's not really where we want to put. That's not really what bucket we want to invest. Like, if we had a priority, we put it over here. I certainly have my own opinions, my own recommendations we can talk about with that, but those do look differently.
What I'm hearing is we're talking is end of March, we should have some clarity or some progress on some of those big ticket items,
Mhm.
right? You're going to kick off the planning, strategic planning in March,
Mhm.
which I think we say August, 4 month. We do this as fast as possible because it's going to drive everything else that's to come. And then in August, we'll have the beginnings of bringing this all together where we can then figure out what that way forward is. It's too late for the November ballot, but we can have then get discussions on C1 and D1, but I'm
I
not
feel
sure.
strongly that, in my opinion, that we cannot wait past November. for
I
some
feel
of those
strongly that
things.
those plans won't pass in November.
And I feel strongly that they will, so
I'm just saying that. That's my
maybe a bet,
pecan pie?
pecan pie.
Pecan pie.
Ashley, if you told us we were going to bring back full day specials, how would that change the facilities plan?
Well, right now, but you'd have specials on a cart, because there's no
Can't do
play. You'd have it on a stage. You'd have it in a cart, and there are specials that you can do that more easily with than other specials. So, like, you know, you can put a choir on a stage. You
But
can-
what we want from a facilities plan, I guess I'm asking how that would change that. If we said,
Mhm.
I think a $65 million football stadium is more important
Yep.
than
the
than
biggest-
specials,
the-
what would that?
The hardest one, like an art classroom, music is your your complex spaces because they have to have some size to be able to accommodate music programs like we have. You have to have some significant storage for musical instruments and things. You have to have some acoustical pieces. An art room is not that drastically different than a science room, right? I mean, you gotta have a sink, you gotta have storage, you have to things. When you start talking about things like music, you start talking about things like more STEM oriented things like cyber and things like that. Those do impact facilities because you have to have some mechanical elements that can run all the electricity and things like that. So there are some pieces that are more facilities heavy than others.
But
Not to underestimate those.
So would C1 and D1 deliver those spaces? Because we're not touching those.
Well, those
elementary
would go into the design. So you'd have
D1, we're not touching the elementary schools.
no, you're not. But you'd have some space freed up because you moved the 6th grade out. So you'd have some space. Now, and
But we'd
and-
be putting
but you
a
have to
music
remember,
class in the classroom.
elementary music is different than secondary music.
You have the facilities for elementary music, but you can also now start instrumental music at sixth grade.
6th grade, correct.
It would be doing something for
That's
that.
true.
If,
That would
Correct.
be, that would be helpful.
So normally in in a K-5 world, it doesn't have to be like this. I want to make sure it does not have to be like this. I mean, there are districts where they pick instruments in the 3rd grade, right? Including strings, right? But a lot of common practice is in like the elementary world, however you define that. It's more of a general music. And then like in the 5th or 6th grade, you have instrument selection and it goes from there.
and we're picking on music here. In the past, we've had instrumental music meet in the cafeteria
Mhm.
after school or whatever.
I mean, at East
for some of
Freshman,
these things.
at East Freshman, the music class meets on the stage. I mean, yes, there's the band room, but they also have to book the stage as well to make sure that they can have the rotation of the schedule that they need.
But I guess my point is, if we say we want C1 or D1, the actual design and plan lets us figure out those priorities and implement those priorities. It's not something I want all the answers now too, but I don't think that we would end up in kind of analysis paralysis like we've been over the past couple of years if we tried to nail all those things out before we
That operating levy. Like you're pushing on like they're getting very close together, right? And I just think about with our community particularly, sometimes you need some space between levies to even be able to comprehend and put your head around that versus they kind of feel back to back. That can feel a certain way.
I truthfully don't think the space would matter. If people know that an operating is coming, like, kind of to both their points, if the operating was out of the question, I think this would pass in November. But we just don't live in that kind of an environment right now. We have an operating that's looming, and I mean, we're not hiding that. And we certainly have to be very transparent when we go out and inform the community about the possibilities. So, right now, if the 2.12, if we go on the ballot with the 2.12, I think it's going to be a very hard sell if people know that there's a potential 3.6 operating coming down the chain. And so for me, the timing doesn't really matter. If we have to wait, if we think that it would, we'd have all of our questions answered by waiting. I think any 4% increase to the construction cost is worth it. Is worth not jumping into an impulsive decision because we're so stressed out about the emergency. It's like if a wooden building is on fire, maybe your first instinct is to put it out with a hose. Well, maybe the hose is too strong, and you actually just destroy the wooden house with an intense an intense hose, so to speak, if that analogy made sense.
We may be in a situation in 6 years with a different board who has different priorities than we do now. And I think one of the things that was the goal of this facilities plan is flexible spaces. So if those priorities change, we can pivot where we need to. I think you have to enable whatever these priorities are, and it will change in the future, but you have to enable them before you just, you can't do it all in one chunk. I think that's what I've learned.
Well, right, but you can't do it all in one chunk, but to have facilities and then no one to staff it would be a pretty big oversight. And so I think you have to do both of them. I'm not saying you have to do both the operating and the capital improvements together, but I think both of them have to be involved in the conversation. You can't sell just the buildings and not have the staffing a part of the conversation. We have to be very transparent with, hey, we're signing off on the buildings now, staffing is to come. And I can't blame us if we're honest. If we're honest and we fail at the ballot, okay. But if we pass this capital improvement and then we come back 2 years later, we're going to have zero trust when we come back with a 3.6 levy and say, hey, we know we didn't talk about this earlier. Yeah, we talked about it. It's recorded, but people are still going to say, hey, you didn't, bring this up before us. We just have to have that a part of the conversation.
Yeah, I think that these conversations are critical to continue having.
Yeah.
For sure.
Well, and remember too, two things. I don't think we're rushing anything. We've been talking about this for
10 years.
ever. Yeah, more than that. But the forecast, again, I applaud Adam because we've never done this. We haven't put the levies in there, and we need to because that's how schools are funded. But it's a snapshot in time. Tomorrow, by some Adam's magic wand of creativity, that operating levy in 2 years could be one mil. I agree. It has to be part of the conversation, but I don't think we can focus on that. It's going to absolutely be a 3.66. It
Right.
could be a 1.22.
It could be 5.
Adam's got a magic wand.
The
It
best
could be,
the best
but-
way to that path would be a lot of new construction without a lot of kids.
Yeah.
That would be the
Build
best.
them,
That
don't
would be the
bring no
best
kids.
route to that path.
Don't bring any kids. Just build the house.
That's a hard projection, but it's possible.
It might be feeling the reduced population numbers that the state's looking at. It's all families with no kids.
Yeah, can I just suggest some, or maybe reflect on some of the comments? Mr. Argo, you really pointed to the question is, what are we trying to solve? Are we trying to solve everything, or are we trying to solve first step of many that you're going to have to face as a board, as an institution? And so that's the real question. What's possible to solve? You're going to have to look at probability of getting voter support. What is going to have the highest percentage of support? Simply, and that's pretty simple concept. If you this great plan that we had just didn't have that. It was complex. There was a lot of reasons. Maybe the timing of it, but at the end of the day, it didn't get the support. So it doesn't help to have a great plan if you can't get the support. So I think that you're going to have to somehow measure what's your highest probability of passing, whether it be November or next year. And then what's going to have the greatest impact, in terms of affordability, in terms of educational value, that definitely needs to be addressed. Now, what I've heard Mr. Horton say is that, hey, we need this bigger plan. Not necessarily that you're going to have. I don't think you're, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're not saying, hey, we got to put that big plan out now and solve everything, but we need to have a long-term vision to be able to explain to folks, hey, there's several steps here, or 3 or 4 or 5, but that and I would agree, there needs to be definition to it. There needs to be, hey, what's impact? What am I getting for my dollars? And I think that's what you're asking for, and I think that's a very fair question. Ultimately, though, you need data, and you're not going to get a whole lot of data by inviting the community to come in and see it 70 more times. Although, if we have a meeting every night until Adam, we might want to take advantage of that. But the
I
reality.
can only hope.
Yeah. We'll call you. We'll see where you are on Thursday night. But ultimately, you need to get that data, and that data has to be as scientific as possible. You need to be able to ask a lot of hard questions. Now, my question to you is: are you willing to put out C1 versus D1 and ask the community, what do you support, 4 buildings or 2 junior highs? If you don't want to hear the answer, then don't put the question out. But you also need, as a board, you need to be reflect that information, that data, and say, okay, we're going to take this in serious consideration. So you get that data, and then you need to have some focus groups, engineered focus groups. It's not going to be an open invitation to all. You could open it up to everybody, but you're going to have to engineer some discussions with a handful of individuals, one-on-one, in which you could ask and further test some of these solutions. But ultimately, you need data. It can't be just, hey, this is what feels right. This is, it can't be emotional, because it's just not going to work for you. You're not going to have success. So we need to work towards getting that data over the next month or month and a half. And that means working and seeing how things get funded, who owns that data. All these things have to be, because you can't ask certain questions that you need to know. So how can we get that information? And we need to move ahead. So that's just the realities of it. There's a lot of, we've already talked about it. There's some challenges working with the state. Good thing is they've got the money. The good thing is, instead of 32%, you get 33%. However, what does that mean, especially with the new enrollment numbers? And then how are you going to roll that information out to your public? That's going to be a difficult credibility questioning element out there. My very last comment is really goes back to understanding what dollars you have. If you go for a bond issue, you're freeing up, you have approximately $25 million that you can dedicate towards permanent improvement, your permanent improvement fund, which would help you, because that's about a 5, based on you're spending 3 million, 3.5, you'd like to be spending 5, but that'll fund it for $5 million. Now, does that help over the short term? Great. But all these solutions we're looking at, the C1s, the D1s, the E's, the F's, the G's, they're not going to happen overnight. So unfortunately, by the time you do need some dollars, and you will, you're not going to have, however efficient the plan is, you're just going to be on year 1 of moving into these buildings. So you're not going to have the savings fast enough to really help you. But what you go with and what you test, you can go, hey, we're going to go with a bond issue and a PI, or we're going to go with a, you can ask 2 different things of your voters on that particular day. So you're not going to get to it unless you have some hard questions that you could get out there very quickly. So sorry, I went probably too long.
No, you're good.
That's very, very helpful.
You're good.
I guess I'm struggling right now because I feel like we've been stuck in an infinite loop of analysis paralysis for 7 years. And how we get out of that loop to create the solutions when each one of us at this table has a different idea of what's best. And because we can't come to consensus or have been unable to come to consensus, then the outcome becomes no traction with anything. And that's where we've been. That feels like where we're headed when I hear about another 2 years. And I just, I caution us because again, like I think it should be one way. I'm sure Adam thinks that, like we all have different things, but we have to figure out a better system, a better vehicle, a better, I don't know if we need a facilitator. Like I feel like we continue to do circles around each other, but because we just are in this paralysis, we're not making any progress and we're not solving our problems. And I'm starting to struggle to see how we're going to solve our problems. And instead we're just going to have, you know, a building with no working toilets. Like I'm been a long day and it's feeling a little, I try to be the optimist and I'm struggling tonight to feel of how we get off this hamster wheel. So I don't know if we need a different vehicle because it just feels like we have meetings,
That don't produce anything.
but we're not moving forward.
So picking up on Tom's thread, I think that this is the opportunity, right? If we can lay out the things that we discussed here that we're thinking could be viable options, including the plans that you've suggested, and we put that out and we get the data on what's resonating and we get to see what kind of positive support we would be getting for those options, whatever they would be. And if it's C1 and D1 and it's great, then we can feel reassured to move forward. If it's no, we need to figure out the longer term and probably then we'd have data to then tell us what would be the best viable option for us to then consider putting onto to try to develop further and put onto a ballot levy. I think we've been working against timelines instead of solutions, and I think the data can help us get to understanding what the community would support and what we could get passed.
I think timelines are as important as the data, though. I feel like we're losing every day we wait, and it's not just the monetary. It's the I struggle with West Freshman and Adena. We have to put money into those to make. We don't want our kids going to school in buildings that are not healthy, for one thing.
Yeah.
And the longer we delay that, the worse that becomes. And I again, it's the good money after bad thing. We were at a Leadership 21 thing on Thursday. Julie and I spoke. We were asked to speak on about Lakota, and a parent in the audience raised her hand and said, well, "What about all the mold?" I'm like, "Oh, okay." That wasn't what we were expecting. She's like, "I have 2 kids at Adena," and she said, I had no idea, or one at Adena and one at Shawnee. She goes, "I had no idea all your buildings had mold." And I'm like,
I do want to clarify.
I said, we
We
clarified.
Guys,
Our
and
buildings
buildings
don't have
that are on a
mold.
quarterly rotation of
Yeah,
scheduling, those are all good,
Yes,
I promise, but that we
said
do
that.
have
We said
8 buildings
currently,
that are on quarterly rotations
Yes,
of testing.
and we said that, but that
Spring
is,
break will be our next, around our next testing.
that was her
measure.
perception. And afterwards, she said to somebody, which I heard secondhand, but after the fact, that I don't know if I can stay in Lakota if some of these problems aren't fixed. And I think that's where we are. I'm not, my desire to be on the ballot in November to fix some of these problems is not a knee-jerk reaction. It is a long battle of things and processes. And again, I would love to be able to fix everything, but I think we have to get a starting point. We've got to do something to start the process down the road and hope that the Powerball gets really high and we win. And we could donate half of it. But that's my concern, is I just feel like we're going to lose families. We're going to not be a desired, forget a destination district. I just want people to stay at this point. And I feel like we've got to make some changes.
So the one thing that you are gonna need and should strive for is a 5-0 vote. You need to achieve consensus. Now, consensus is not that you all think alike,
Mhm.
or you think that option A is the very best, but that you agree to move ahead. You can accept option A as a good solution and move ahead with it. So it might not be your first choice, but it's probably your second choice. But you need to have that 5-0. What I heard from this board over and over again, and you will, I would bet strongly that all of you think that there is a problem to be solved. I don't think there's any one of you that I've heard, you know what, this really doesn't need to be talked about. And that's an important start. That you all are agreeing that yes, we've got to do something. We've got real issues and they need to be addressed sooner than later. So,
And I think a decision, in my opinion, making that decision on a 5-0 vote is, for me, it's not saying this is what I want and I am gonna lay down and put my stake in the ground. Maybe somebody says, okay, I like C1, but I want to tweak and I want to do this, or I want to have a better understanding of this. I do agree that we need to get there, and it doesn't mean that everybody's going to agree about everything, that they get everything that they want, because I don't think any of us even know what we want, because there's so much.
I think we all want something that the community will support and come out and pass. And so I think
I would agree.
if we can use the facilities subcommittee to lay out kind of, Tom, how you described getting this data, laying out what plans we'd want to share with the community, and do a data survey to understand that, and then follow up with focus groups. I think we'd have a robust understanding of, oh, C1D1, that's it, that's going to work. I'd get behind that if I had that data. If it's, ooh, that's not going to work but a combination of a levy and income tax thing would work, okay, then that's what it would look like. I mean, I think that's where that's where how I see us getting off the hamster wheel, like you said, Julie, is how do we get data to inform what we can get behind?
I would totally 100% agree with you to get that put in our community, but I don't know how to get them. I don't know how to get them to tell us. I don't know how to get the
I think-
masses engaged.
Well, I think and I don't want to put
I
words
don't know how to
in,
get them. That's what I.
I don't
struggle
want to
with.
put words in Tom's mouth, but, we're gonna need a statistically relevant survey.
Right.
This is not a thought exchange.
Agreed.
This is where, like, the 400 people mathematically represent the 100,000 people. Like,
Yeah.
that's what we gotta
Yeah.
have, right? Because I think otherwise you don't have any confidence in the data that you're
Right.
extrapolating. It's a different type of data set. So we need to make sure that it is statistically relevant so that we can extrapolate that data to the masses to make sure that it would pass, right? Or that it would be, or that there's traction around an option rather than, not that it would pass, but there's traction around an option. And so I think probably our next steps is to put that together. And again, at March 10th, we will hopefully have some finalized busing conversations. We'll be well on the way to working through the capital planning pieces. And we can start looking at some of those pieces. So I think trying to figure out, like how Tom said it. Tom said, who's owning the data and who's funding the data, right? Those are some big questions. And then the questions that we need to ask to get to that data.
We have a plan for March 10th.
Mhm.
Sounds good.
Does anybody?
I will say,
Thank
and I do think Tom made a very good point, and it's probably because Julie and Adam and I sat through a negotiations training today. I think sometimes when you say consensus, it is that everybody is like absolutely on the same page, right? And it was good for me to hear in a room today of probably 30 people, all with very different roles in this organization, to say their definition of consensus is, can you get 70% there, right? Can you carry the banner? It might not be your first choice, but can you carry the banner together and say, yeah, it might not be my 100%, but I'm there with you and we can support each other in that decision. And I think, to Tom's point, if we can get that consensus, again, not 100%, but like, I'm there, I can support that.
Yeah.
I think that is important for our community to say, they understand we're 7 different people, but we all work together in that collective voice to say, yep, we have the data to support that this is the plan, right? So I think looking at that will help us hopefully reach that consensus that we need to move forward and figure out that timeline and those funding sources. Okay.
Anything else?
I think we have some next steps.
Okay, well then, thank you all for coming. I would like to have a motion to adjourn.
So, second.
Mr. Zink, I have no idea who first and second that, but, okay.
Mr. Wynn,
Yes.
Ms. Schaefer,
Yeah.
Mr. Argo,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Ms. Kaiser.